You have more ability to store information in a human brain than you do in over 2,000 home computers. Unbelievable. But in so doing, we have made it so that we don't have a lot of reserve. We don't have a lot of durability. And so if you look at all these subsystems, the neuroplasticity of Alzheimer's, the motor modulation of Parkinson's, the power amplification of ALS, or the fine vision of the macula, all of these things are these highly tuned systems that unfortunately suffer from antagonistic pleiotropy.
We are each the architects of our brain's destiny. The choices that we make each and every day really play out in terms of determining whether our brain's going to be along for the ride or not. And we're going to be finding out today what we should actually be doing to stave off things like neurodegenerative conditions, like Alzheimer's, for example. We're going to be looking at this book, The Ageless Brain, by my good friend, Dr. Dale Bredesen, an incredible book full of insight. We're going to learn all of the things that we can be doing right now to preserve and protect our brains. Let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Bredesen. Dale Bredesen, MD, is an internationally recognized neurologist with specialty expertise in the mechanisms of neurodegenerative diseases. He is the Senior Director of Precision Brain Health at Pacific Neuroscience Institute and the Chief Science Officer of Apollo Health. Guided by his philosophy and belief that Alzheimer's disease is not just preventable but reversible, Dr. Bredesen's innovative research has helped explain the physical mechanisms behind the erosion of memory seen in Alzheimer's disease. His decades of clinical study and the neurological research that he's performed have opened the door for new approaches, including his RECODE protocol, also known as the Bredesen protocol. And this methodology has emerged as a viable attempt to prevent, arrest, and even reverse symptoms of cognitive decline associated with things like Alzheimer's. Very excited to welcome our good friend, Dr. Dale Bredesen, to the program. Let's get right to it. Well, hello, Dr. Bredesen. Welcome again to the program.
Great to see you, David. Always great to talk with you.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a while, and I have my list of questions I was going to ask you, but before we started, we were just talking about how there still seems to be such pushback on the amazing results that you're getting in actually reversing Alzheimer's disease. But you indicated that you actually have a phase 3 trial coming up. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we've got a randomized controlled trial that is ongoing, and we actually have done the interim analysis. Now, this will be completed end of October of 2025, but we've just enrolled the last person, and we've done essentially a halfway analysis for the entire trial. And there's just a statistically significant improvement in the patients who are treated, and the control group, which is getting standard of care neurological treatment for cognitive decline, there is no statistically significant difference. So there is a clear difference between the two statistically, and that's exactly
so
what
you
we
have
have.
Patients with clinically proven Alzheimer's disease, and some of the group is getting amyloid-related treatment?
No, they're getting the standard of care as published recently. So it's basically Aricept if they have dementia. It is, it's standard evaluation, standard treatment by a standard neurology approach versus a precision medicine-based protocol where you're looking at all the different pieces that drive the decline. And it's interesting. A couple of the control group have shown some improvement. And it's the ones that ended up having sleep apnea or that ended up having low B12s or things like that were identified and treated. So it comes back to the notion that going after these things with a monotherapeutic really doesn't make any scientific sense.
We're going to have a lot to talk about, that's for sure. The first thing I guess it'd be the second thing now, that why does conventional medicine not understand what you're doing and certainly doesn't embrace what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the answer is because medicine has had as you well know, has had a major schism into classical medicine, pharmaceutical monotherapeutic medicine, which works very well for things like pneumococcal pneumonia, and then functional medicine, precision medicine, integrative medicine, where you're looking at networks and you're looking at systems biology instead of looking at what's the one thing I can do to cure this network illness. And so I think what's happened is we see that if you've got a broken leg or pneumococcal pneumonia, classical medicine is going to do very well for you. But if you have a complex chronic illness, be it Alzheimer's, Lewy body, ALS, cancer, cardiovascular disease, chronic renal failure, any of these complex chronic illnesses, you need to look at the whole network. You need to look at what is driving this. Of course, as Jeffrey Bland has been telling us all for what now, 35 years. So I think that's the schism. And so, of course, the pushback from standard of care medicine is, well, we don't believe it until we see 10,000 people. I always tell people, look, talk to some of the patients who've improved. When you've talked to them, when you've seen their scores, when you've seen their MRIs improve, when you've seen their symptoms improve and remain improved. We just published a paper freely available online, over a decade of improvement in some of these people. Then you can't really deny it.
Well, nonetheless, it is being at least derogated, if not denied, by mainstream. I mean, we are led, when I say we, I think mainstream neurology and I think the general public has been led to believe that the cause, end of story, cause of Alzheimer's is the accumulation of beta amyloid in the brain. And therefore, if we can target beta amyloid, for which drugs have been developed, problem solved. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, the problem is that if you remove the amyloid, the people don't get better. In fact, the best you do is that you can slow the decline a little in some people. Now, here's a great example. If you look at the data that came out from the drug company, from Biogen, Eisai, the Lilly, the groups that were doing the anti-amyloid therapy, then what you see is quite interesting. The people who were ApoE44, and though this is 7 million Americans, and in the trial, of course, it represents about 10% of overall Alzheimer's disease. They actually got worse than control. Now, of course, that wasn't mentioned in the publication, but in the evaluation of the publication by an objective third party, it was pointed out, well, these people actually got worse, not better. So just yesterday, I was contacted by a guy who ApoE44, early symptoms, very treatable, had been to one of the world's great centers of excellence, and they had told him, well, you should probably get on anti-amyloid therapy. Well, no, they didn't read the paper, apparently. So, that would be considered malpractice if someone other than a major university were doing it.
Well, what happened was that the FDA approval was really focused on using reduction of amyloid load as the biomarker surrogate for improvement or being effective treatment for Alzheimer's. And it's completely erroneous because didn't happen that way. These people are not getting better, and that doesn't seem to be, the proximate cause of Alzheimer's disease. So, and yet I think standard of care is really moving towards using amyloid-based therapies to treat this disease.
Isn't it amazing? This is complete circular reasoning. We think amyloid causes this, even though it hasn't been shown to do that. Of course, if you add a bunch of amyloid to a mouse brain, of course the mouse doesn't function as well. No surprise. I mean,
no, you know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the original mouse data with respect to the photoshopped images as it related to some of their findings being, that was interesting. But, I think what you've done, and the reason I praised you so in the forward to one of your books, the End of Alzheimer's program, I think it was, is because, aside from your great successes in reversing Alzheimer's in ApoE44 patients and obviously others, just the idea that, you've really led us all to the understanding as it relates to this disease that it has to be a multifactorial approach, that the idea of one tool in the toolbox really is a disservice to people, thinking that this is the cause, amyloid accumulation, fix the amyloid, problem solved. And it doesn't work. It does not work. There's not a single patient who has had their Alzheimer's reversed by targeting only their beta amyloid. Is that a fair statement?
That's, to my knowledge, there is not a single person. Now, of course, we see population data, but as far as I know, nobody does. And as you pointed out, the best this does is just you're slowing, you're not improving people. So again, you and I always focus on one thing. What's the best outcomes we can get for patients? That's really the only important question. So whatever nutrients it takes, whatever evaluation it takes, whatever drug it takes, fine, whatever it is that gets you the best outcomes. And to date, the best outcomes unquestionably have been with just what you said, this multi-targeted approach where you're finding, and what's interesting is, David, different people have Alzheimer's for different reasons. So for some
Wait,
people,
wait,
it's
wait,
sleep
wait.
apnea is
Different
critical.
people have Alzheimer's for different reasons. I thought everybody had Alzheimer's because they accumulated beta amyloid. That's the messaging that comes to me when I open any neurology journal and look at the very first page, which is an ad generally for Leqembi.
Yeah.
And that is that this is the cause, here is the solution, end of story.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting? But when you actually look at it, and as you know, we spent 30 years in the lab looking at what are the things that drive this molecular biology, what actually makes your brain degenerate. And when you look at it, there are just about everybody has multiple factors. And starting with the genetics that you mentioned, ApoE4 is a common one. 75 million Americans have a single copy, 7 million Americans have two copies. And of course, that increases your risk markedly. Then there are people with sleep apnea, where that's an important driver. There are people with changes in the oral microbiome, with chronic sinusitis, with a leaky gut that, of course, you've been writing about and talking about for years, with microbiome changes in the gut. There are people who have various chronic infections. Of course, herpes simplex has turned out, as we've been hearing from Professor Itzaki for many, many years. All of these things. And so we have to change our understanding of this disease to recognize that this is ultimately a network insufficiency. You have this beautiful network of 500 trillion synapses, and you begin to lose that as you are switching from a connection mode to a protection mode. And it is a beautiful systems biology story that tells us exactly why we get this and what to do about it.
Well, it's not as if beta amyloid's not playing a role, but it's a
Oh,
downstream issue, and in fact, may be a response element in the brain, as Dr. Tanzi pointed out, being an antimicrobial peptide. In fact, I think that Ruth Itzaki's work kind of inferred that when she demonstrated co-localization of HSV with beta amyloid in human specimens. So the idea that herpes simplex may be playing a role, I think to hang our hats as that being the causative agent, again, pigeonholes us. Nor is amyloid, nor is chlamydia pneumonia, nor is porphyromonas gingivalis, as you mentioned, coming from the oral microbiome. I stumbled upon a book. I will show you this book, The Microbiome and the Brain. Do you remember this?
yeah, of
So
course.
you were kind enough to write a chapter of for that book for me many years ago when we were just starting to look at this relationship. But you bring up the oral microbiome, and that is, why on earth would we pay attention to our mouth bacteria if we're talking Alzheimer's disease?
And here's a really interesting study I'm sure you're aware of, came out 2 years ago. And what they showed was just taking normal brains, Alzheimer brains, and Parkinson's brains, and looking at various regions of the brain, and then doing sequencing and asking, what are the things that are in a quote, normal brain microbiome? Now, when you and I were training years ago, we were, of course, taught that the brain is a sterile organ. That has not turned out to be the case. There is a brain microbiome. And there are some differences in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but it's not simple yet what's actually driving this. But here's the fascinating thing. The majority of the organisms that were found in the normal brain microbiome were, guess what? Oral microbiota. So it is, your oral microbiome is reflected in the mirror of your brain. And that is a scary thought if you've got some P. gingivalis and some T. denticola and some F. nucleatum and all these sorts of things. So this is going to be very important going forward for us to optimize our oral and brain microbiomes.
Well, when you say it's scary, yeah, I think on the one hand, especially as it relates to periodontal disease, but on the other hand, it does open the door for opportunity then when we are able, if we become able to identify those organisms, especially as they relate to then doing their damage in the brain. And I think to be clear, what seems to be obvious is that these organisms and other events, other organisms and other proteins and damage associated molecular patterns, et cetera, seem to do
Right.
their damage by changing what the microglia are doing, the brain's immune cells, and thereby helping to increase inflammation in the brain that then also changes these microglia such that they're less able to deal, for example, with beta amyloid and phosphorylated tau.
Yeah, this is such a good point, and it brings up something I'm working on currently, and something obviously you're working on for your new book, which I'm excited to read about microglia. And as you pointed out in your lecture recently, you really have these two states, and that which state you're sitting with is so critically important. So here's the interesting thing. As you said earlier, there's no question amyloid is part of the response. It is an antimicrobial peptide. And guess what? P-tau is also antimicrobial. Guess what? Alpha-synuclein of Parkinson's and Lewy body and MSA, that's also antimicrobial. So it's becoming very clear. You have insults, often changes in microbiome, often in chronic infections. Part of the response to these, part of your innate system's response, is these things that we vilify as causing the diseases. They're a little bit like long-acting cytokines. They are part of the response. So what we are proposing is that these prions, and A beta has turned out to be a prion, as well as PRPSC, as well as alpha-synuclein, these things we already know can sit in your brain for decades, protecting the brain. And so they don't just give you the disease like this. They sit there. And so what we are proposing is that these are pre-inflammatory immune mediators, which is essentially prions, so that they can give you a period. They're buying you as long as you mentioned Itsaki's work, as long as the MOI is low, as long as you've got a low pathogen burden, you can surround and destroy the pathogen without getting into a big inflammatory response, which compromises your neural function. And if you do everything well, you can have amyloid, as you know, in your brain for decades and still do quite well. It's when you get that microglial activation, when you get those cytokines going, when you get that pro-inflammatory effect, that's when things decline.
Yes, and in the rodent research, the microglial activity is fundamental for the pathological effects of the beta amyloid. When these mice are genetically selected with high levels of beta amyloid, the real pathology, the real digestion of synapses, et cetera, that happens really is microglial dependent. Forming what you had, I think, originally called a synaptopathy, the digestion of the vital connections, one neuron to the next, that so typifies Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's a synaptoporosis in a way when you're losing these synapses. And of course, as you know, even before that, you're losing them functionally, and then you start losing them structurally, and then ultimately, of course, you lose the cells themselves. So you really have different periods, and the earlier you start, the better off you are, and there's so much more you can do.
Well, hi everyone, Dr. David Promoter here. We hope you're enjoying this content, and if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community, so let's get right back to the presentation. Well, let's just focus, because I know you've been spending a lot of time in talking about these synapses being really kind of fundamental to what makes a good brain work well and what suffers when the brain degenerates. How can we connect so many of the lifestyle recommendations that you make in your new book to ultimately leading us to preserving our synapses? I know it seems like a long way, but I think we can do it.
No, that's actually a perfect question, because what the research has shown over the years is that there are basically three major players and three minor players when it comes to keeping your brain functional as you age. And this includes avoiding Alzheimer's, avoiding Parkinson's, avoiding Lewy body disease, etc. So if you focus and optimize those 6 things, you do better. And of course, our goal in the new book is to make it so that we can all have a brain span that is long as our lifespan. If you're going to live to 99 or 100 or whatever, you don't want your brain to stop at 60 or 70. You want it to be there just as long as you are. So I often tell the YPO members, who wants to live to 140? A lot of hands go up, and then I say, and spend half of that time in a nursing home with dementia. Of course,
The
nobody
hands
wants
go
to do
back
it.
down.
Exactly. So we want to keep people sharp. So the 3 big ones, as you know, are energetics. You've got to have the oxygen, you've got to have the blood flow, you've got to have the mitochondrial function. And that's what is decreasing in so many people. You can keep that up and you can keep that rolling and do much better. Second one is inflammation, just what you were talking about. Whether it's from Borrelia, Babesia, the P. gingivalis that you mentioned earlier, whatever it is, if you've got ongoing inflammation in the brain, that is putting a greater load on the brain. It makes it harder for you to get that threshold. You've got to bring your supply greater than your demand. And that's true for all of these neurodegenerative diseases. And then the third one is toxicity. If you are, and so unfortunately now we're hearing all about microplastics and their compromise of brain function. And it's been, COVID has been another big one. So many of the people that we see were doing pretty well with their cognition until they got COVID, and now they're having more problems. So anything that is driving that from various toxins like mercury, air pollution has been a big one. And of course, with the recent California fires, this is a concern for so many people. And with all the other issues, all the things that we're exposed to from cosmetics to ultra processed food that you've written so much about, these are all things that put drag on what you're able to accomplish in your brain. So those are the big 3. Then the smaller 3 are neurotrophins, things that are trophic for your brain, and that's hormones, nutrients like vitamin D and vitamin B12 and things like that. And then neurotrophins themselves like nerve growth factor and BDNF and things like that. And then the second thing is neurotransmission. So you've got to have enough acetylcholine, you've got to have enough dopamine, you've got to have enough GABA, glutamate, et cetera, to make these things function. And then finally, interestingly, stress. Something that, as many, many years in the lab, I thought, stress is not a big deal. Turned out, yes, I can't deny the statistics and the data. It is a huge issue. And as you know, just having long-term stress will shrink your brain, that alone. So great to have a little bit and then resolve it. But this chronic ongoing stress is very damaging to brain function. So if you take those 6 things and you optimize those, you can get rid of early changes that would have become Alzheimer's. This is why I've been so excited about the new blood tests, because you can now see things coming for the first time, and you can make sure that you never get dementia.
Well, let's unpack the blood test a little bit. And there's 3 components. The first one is this phosphorylated tau, or p-tau 217. Why is that important?
Yeah, so tau, as you know, is a fascinating molecule because it has a double life. So normally what tau does is tau binds, it's literally the bolts that stabilize your microtubules so that you can reach out and make connections. That's when you're in connection mode. This same molecule, when you now have insults and you're now switching to protection mode, becomes phosphorylated, which changes its charge and changes its shape. It pops off the microtubules, which now allows the neurites to collapse. And it now becomes, interestingly, an antimicrobial prion. So it will beget more of itself. It will kill microbes. This goes back to like the musket, the Minutemen in the Revolutionary War. They're farmers 1 minute, then they're shooting muskets the next minute. And this is the same thing that tau does. It goes back and forth between stabilization and antimicrobial activity. So we can pick that up in the blood, and you can see what your tau level is. And there's been a tremendous amount of work, especially by this group, Neurocode, looking at, does this actually reflect what you see in the brain? And the striking relationship between phospho-tau levels in the blood, it's specifically p-tau 217 in the blood, and the amount of amyloid in the brain and ongoing pathology in the brain. So everybody should know their blood pressure, their lipids, and should also know their p-tau 217. I just had mine checked a few weeks ago. Very happy to see that it was normal. I'll check it again in 2 years.
I saw
For
your
those,
results, as you know.
yes, I was happy. I was happy they were okay. Everyone from 35 years and on should every 5 years until you get to 60, and then above that you start checking every 2 years. As you start, if you see it going up, you can deal with it.
I want to let our viewers know that in a moment I'll give you, we'll discuss where people can have these tests, but let's go through all three. I think the next one would be GFAP. Can we talk about
Yeah,
that?
great point. And that is glial fibrillary acidic protein. That is an intermediate filament protein. So what happens when your astrocytes that are supporting your neurons now balloon up and start to react because you're in inflammation mode or because you are trying to do some rebuilding, they essentially, like the Hulk, they boom, they hyperactivate, and when they do that, they are building with GFAP. So they've got to have that as a protein that now goes up. You can again pick that up in the blood. So if your GFAP is high, it tells you something quite different. It tells you that you've got ongoing inflammation and or reconstruction in your brain. So when I see patients, if their p-tau is high and their GFAP is high, I know they have active Alzheimer's. If the GFAP is normal, the p-tau is high, they have much more quiescent Alzheimer's. And if the p-tau is low and the GFAP is high, they've got some inflammation going on or repair in their brain. They may have had a head injury or something like that. So it's quite complementary and very helpful information to have.
The third one is neurofilament light, which is certainly a little bit less specific, but important nonetheless.
Again, complementary information. So, for example, if you've got a normal p-tau, a normal GFAP, but a high NFL, the first concern is frontotemporal dementia. That is a common one to give you that pattern. It could also be, as you said, it could be something like a recent traumatic injury. Could be anything that is damaging neurons. So you get three very complementary pieces, and when you put them together, you really can get a very nice picture of what is ongoing in the brain.
And you don't need to, this isn't something your doctor would necessarily order, but you can get the test nonetheless. How do you go about that?
Yeah, you can get it actually directly. So very, very simple. You go to Get a Brain Scan. So we've called this Brain Scan. We've worked with the group that's doing the most sensitive one. So if you just go to GETA Brain Scan, GETABRAINSCAN.com, you can actually have mobile phlebotomy. Actually, I had it drawn here at my home. Which was great. And then also what we've put together is an algorithm, which is the only one here for these tests, where you can actually get an interpretation that goes through all the different pieces, tells you the limitations of them, tells you what the reading means, and what to do about it.
So, and again, this is something you recommend for everyone, even if they're not having any obvious cognitive issues.
Absolutely. This is just like telling if someone, you should check your fasting insulin or your hemoglobin A1C. You don't want to wait to have full-on diabetes because you're going to start having problems with your eyes, your kidneys, etc. So you want to catch it at that early phase and make sure that you never get full-on diabetes. The same thing is true for Alzheimer's. You want to see it coming. So this now allows us for the first time to say, okay, well, you don't have Alzheimer's, but you have pre-Alzheimer's. We can make sure that you never get full-on dementia related to Alzheimer's.
It's
So that's the
exactly
key.
like tackling the pre-diabetic before it converts to being full-on diabetic.
Exactly.
Earlier as you were talking, I was just thinking, what is the experience of most patients who are now challenged with cognitive decline? They go to their generalist, refer to a neurologist, and really the only question really asked, do you or don't you qualify for a beta amyloid drug? That's
Yeah.
really it. When you start talking about, looking for Babesia or other type of, or a co-infection of Babesia, looking at, oral health, looking at the risk, do you have sleep apnea? What is your blood sugar doing? What is your metabolism like? That doesn't happen in a neurology office. And, I think, the messaging is that this is the best we have, beta amyloid drugs, and they it's just it's very, very challenging to really confront that right now in this conversation with you, that's where we are in 2025. It does kind of take your breath away.
It does take your breath away. When you and I were residents, if someone had told me, "Oh, there's something you can actually do," someone's out there publishing, reversal of cognitive decline, I would have been on the phone or on a plane within a few minutes or hours to like, what the heck are you doing? Like, well, let's do this. And yet we have such pushback because this field has become so politicized. It's really sad. And of course, as you indicated, it's related to selling drugs. There are the drugs out there. I talked to a guy yesterday who had gone to his major center, as I mentioned earlier. And I said, okay, did they check your sleep study? No. Did they check your gut to see if you have leaky gut? No. Did they check your oral microbiome? No. I mean, I just go through one after the other after the other. Nothing. Nothing.
15 minutes in, here's the drug, you qualify or not. It is a bit challenging, but it's Max Lugavere once said it's diagnose and adios. And
Yeah, that's exactly
I
right.
guess that's, from a doctor's office perspective, it's certainly the most efficient way of dealing with things. You mentioned looking at the gut microbiome, and I think back years ago when, we were doing early on, this might be 17 years ago, stool analysis on patients with neurological problems. The pushback that I got was just so aggressive. Why on earth would you be looking at stool analyses on patients who are having cognitive decline or Parkinson's or migraine headache or multiple sclerosis? And I remember, one of the first published studies that we did was on a series of 20 patients with MS versus control of their stool analysis. And we found some very interesting uniqueness. And these are days where we're just looking at the species level. We weren't looking at metabolomics, at just the changes that we were seeing in broad categories. We didn't have the tools, of course, that we have today to be more granular, but nonetheless, recognizing that that's where it all begins in terms of immune regulation and certainly inflammation. And now we're all appreciating how much the gut and the microbes are influencing metabolism, and how fundamental that is in terms of brain health, and through the notion of immunometabolism, how that affects what we spoke of earlier, the microglial cells and their functionality and their relationship to beta amyloid. So it's a lot of work. And I think that, if somebody were to ask me, why hasn't Dale Bredesen's program, the RECODE program, become the global way that Alzheimer's is addressed? I think it's because it's intellectually challenging, it's time consuming, and it's resource consuming as well. But I think most importantly, it's just so paradigm challenging. That we live in a world of monotherapy, and as I that was the reason I wrote your foreword, is because that's what you've done. You've made us realize that monotherapy ain't going to cut it in Alzheimer's, and it's going to take this comprehensive approach, and you're doing it.
Yeah, and we're still trying to understand all the mechanisms and how do we get better and better outcomes. But I do think, David, I look forward to the day when we have a public health approach where it's essentially hierarchical. So you've got the basics, and everyone gets on the basics, the things that you've talked about for years, and then we say, okay, a few of those people then begin to get some symptoms. Okay, those people, then you need to take that next, you need to look further. And then a few of those will fall through the cracks. So you then put your resources into the few people that really do need them. And the vast majority of people never get that far. And that's, again, why knowing your p-tau is so helpful. If it's normal, you're in good shape. Check it again in the 5 years down the road. But if you're already abnormal, don't worry about it. There's something you can do about it. And I've got to tell you, we've had two people recently that both ApoE44, both in their late 70s, both had symptoms about 5 years ago, were starting to have Alzheimer's disease. They both went on the protocol. They both did very well. They both just checked their p-taus, and one of them's completely normal. The other one's borderline to the indeterminate. Neither anywhere close.
You have a metric.
We have a metric, exactly.
And can follow your intervention. That's what is so necessary.
Exactly. And we're doing this in our trial as well.
Yeah, nice. And then we'll reconnect when you have your results. But let me get back to metricizing and the notion of looking at data. What's so popular these days is the use of continuous glucose monitor
Yes.
because of the value of knowing your blood sugar regulation and insulin responsiveness, et cetera. How does that relate to the brain?
Yeah, this is such a good point because you could argue that this is the most common contributor to cognitive decline. And of course, you're and my colleague Rick Johnson, and you and I were all involved in publishing the paper about a year ago related to fructose and related to uric acid, and how the surprise that when you look at these various parameters of Alzheimer's and you look at what fructose does to the brain, they really line up scarily perfectly. So there's no question that this involves things like insulin resistance, and we see it all the time. So, when you power a brain, it's very much like a Prius. You've only got two things. In the case of the brain, you've got glucose and you've got ketones. Now, for many of us, as we're getting past 40, we lose both of that. We become insulin resistant, as you've talked about so many times over the years. So now we're no longer able to use glucose appropriately. And when you look at a PET scan, that's what you see: poor glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal region. That's the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. But now, because you have insulin resistance and high insulin levels, you now can no longer make ketones. So literally, your brain is sputtering like a Prius that has no gas and no electricity. It doesn't have either of the things it needs. So what we want to do then is bring back the insulin sensitivity, and we want to then bring back the ability to make ketones. So at the beginning, we just give exogenous ketones, and as people like Mary Newport and Stephen Kinane have shown, that is helpful for people even with MCI. And so we want to restore those things, and that's critical. When we used to grow brain cells in a dish in the lab, which we did for years and years, you had to always include insulin in their medium or they wouldn't survive. Insulin is such a crucial trophic factor for neurons.
I think that's really an important thought. I mean, people, I guess, get their arms around the notion of insulin and its role in terms of glucose metabolism, but its role as a trophic hormone in the brain, along with BDNF, a trophic modulator, I think is really very important. And, interestingly, when we're talking about metabolism and mitochondrial utilization of glucose versus utilizing ketones for fuel, I think it's relevant in terms of another metabolic shift. And it gets us back to these microglial cells, the brain's immune cells, and how they, when they're metabolically compromised, when they shift to glycolysis and changing, their ATP production. So it's a metabolic shift that's been instituted in these cells. Then they're much more involved in producing these various pro-inflammatory cytokines that circulate around the brain and spread their bad news to other microglial cells, explaining why it is that diseases progress. I mean, we see things, for example, like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, where football players bang their heads once too many times. They have an issue, but that issue propagates and worsens over time, though they retired from football. They're not hitting their heads anymore. You think of pugilistic Parkinson's, like Muhammad Ali, getting worse with time. So, what you're talking about then is if we are able to address metabolism systemically, like Sarah Hallberg did describe, that we have an option then, an opportunity rather, to rewrite even brain metabolism. To be fair, that's kind of one of the central theses of your new book, that, brain issues are generally metabolic and as such under our control based upon our lifestyle choices.
Yeah, this is a very good point. And so one of the points here is that there's something called antagonistic pleiotropy, which is the best explanation for aging, and it's the most accepted evolutionary mechanism of aging. And what it basically says is, as we evolved, what happened was we always selected performance over durability. So you're selecting something that could give you better fitness when you're young, but could give you a problem when you get older. And this happened again and again. And this is the same sort of thing that has happened in our nervous system. So we have this incredibly amazing nervous system. You have more ability to store information in a human brain than you do in over 2,000 home computers. Unbelievable. But in so doing, we have made it so that we don't have a lot of reserve. We don't have a lot of durability. And so if you look at all these subsystems and the neuroplasticity of Alzheimer's, the motor modulation of Parkinson's, the power amplification of ALS, or the fine vision of the macula, all of these things are these highly tuned systems that unfortunately suffer from antagonistic pleiotropy. So we've got to look to see, how do we now optimize? We got our supply and our demand. And as we get older, the demand goes up because of inflammation and toxicity. The supply goes down because of nutrients, blood flow, oxygenation. So we've got to rebalance that if we're going to get best outcomes. And this is what we're talking about in the book. How do you get your brain span to be at least as long as your lifespan?
God willing.
Yeah.
You know, I think people may get the value of exercise, certainly sleep, being out of doors. I think one of the easier on-ramps rather, are various nutritional supplements. And in the book, gratefully, you didn't shy away from that. And there are a few key players, and I'd like just to talk about a couple. I know it's difficult to make a broad reaching recommendation for everyone, but if we had to look at a handful of supplements that are generally good for the brain, where would we begin?
Yeah, it's a great point. And you're right. What's really exciting, the armamentarium, which you and I were taught years ago, is zero. There's nothing you can do about cognitive decline. The armamentarium is huge, and it's growing. And as you said, basic things like how you sleep. Did you get enough REM sleep? Did you get enough deep sleep and all that? But it does absolutely include supplements, because we know the chemistry of the brain is changing as we age. So, I have a number of favorites, but again, it goes a little bit it's personalized. It's whatever is working for you. So I like, resolvins because they are quite good at resolving ongoing inflammation. For those of us who have ongoing inflammation, I happen to like those. And of course, they go also with omega-3s. I like those. I happen to like magnesium threonate. For many people, one of the reasons I like that is because it's actually had trials, things where there are data to actually
Yes,
show,
correct.
yes, people did better with magnesium threonate.
Dale, let me hold you right there for 1 second. When you say resolvin, so for those of you who want to know what that means, the product that you want to look for is something called pro-resolving mediators. There's several brands out there, but that'll be, if you go online, what you want to look for are pro-resolving mediators. And the next thing was magnesium threonate. Go ahead, Dale. Sorry.
Yeah. And then I like a triad for all of us who have any question about our vessels, for people who are vasculopaths or have any issues with lipids. I like the triad of nattokinase, and I take nattokinase myself,
As do I.
because I have an LP little a that's too high. So, okay, I counter that to some extent with nattokinase.
I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. Good.
I think, we'll see.
You need vitamin D and K along with it, right?
Exactly, of course. But I also like to do arterosyl HP, so something that's essentially supporting the vessels. And as you know, that has turned out to be an interesting part for long COVID, which
The
Dr.
glycocalyx.
Hanaway. Exactly. So I like that piece. And then, of course, the nitric oxide. And so whether you like Super Beats or like Neo 40 or whatever you happen to like to boost up. And of course, there's been a lot of work on things like Cialis and things like that. So one way or another, and you've obviously been teaching us a lot about the importance of nitric oxide in the brain.
Yes. So I'm taking Vasconox by Calgary for that. But so let's talk about that. Why is nitric oxide such an important player for the brain?
So striking, because it is dilating the vessels and allowing the blood flow that you need. And this is also, by the way, why I love EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy,
You talk about that in the
because
book. You have a whole
yes,
section
because
dedicated to it.
it gives you that double positive of having greater blood flow as well as having greater oxygenation. And a lot of what we see, again, this is a network insufficiency. We're pulling back because we don't quite have the support that we need for those 500 trillion synapses. Okay, let's increase our support. Let's increase that blood flow. Let's increase that oxygenation. Let's increase that support. All these things are literally getting you on the other side of that threshold. So you're now back in the connection mode and out of the protection mode once again.
So let me throw something at you that is maybe a little conjectural, but melatonin, where does that fall?
I take it. And I tend to take small amounts in the 1 to 3 milligram range because that's what works for me. Other people like much more, and of course, it has a nice anti-COVID effect. It's got an effect on your immune system, as Dr. Klinghardt has preached. But I do think this is something that, as you know, goes down a little bit as we age. And it's a very normal. I like to try to get as much physiological and upstream as possible, things that are natural to our lives. I'm not trying to trick Mother Nature. And so giving some melatonin, I like it.
Well, and you talked about this in your book. You said these are supplements, and by definition, they are supplemental to a good diet. But far be it for us to be able to really get all the things that we need in and source all of those things in the types of foods that are available to us today. I think one of the best meals I ever had was at your house that Aida prepared. I'll never forget that afternoon. And it was colorful and it was plant based and it was wonderful. But we travel, we're not always eating right, so we do need to supplement, I believe, the nutrient availability from our meals. And you made that very clear in the book. The next thing, let me ask you about creatine monohydrate or creatine in general, not specifying the type. What are your views on creatine?
I am a big fan of creatine because, again, if you look at what are the things that we can do to enhance our energy, and of course, part of that is exercising, getting out, and even having positive attitudes. These are all helpful. But supporting that, you can think about things like urolithin A for your
I
mitochondria,
was just going to
a
ask you.
postbiotic, as you've pointed out before. Creatine is a great one. It's boosting energy, and people notice it. One of the guys I talked to recently said, what I really noticed changed me and improved my cognition was when I added MCT oil to my morning shake. And like suddenly, boom, he noticed it was a clear, noticeable change in his energetics and in his cognition. So again, we're kind of not hitting on all cylinders when we get a little older, and just changing these things. And creatine is a great one. As is things like increasing your ketones with whether it's MCT oil, whether it's ketone salts or esters, whether it's coconut oil. Mary Newport has been writing to me recently and saying, "Hey, we've got new stuff on coconut oil," and showing that they're getting quite nice results with that. So these are all ways to support our energetics to our brain.
Hmm. And in the probiotic realm, we're seeing a lot of new data about Akkermansia muciniphila.
Yeah.
And what are what are your perceptions on that?
Like all these new things, when they come out, they look like they're white knights. Everything's perfect. And then you start looking, and well, there are times when it's not what you want. So I don't think it's going to be that simple. Akkermansia good, less Akkermansia bad. There was one study that suggested that high Akkermansia was associated with ALS. So I think that it's like anything else. It's part of an optimal microbiome, and we're going to begin to understand how much do you want, where do you want it, when do you want it, those sorts of things. So I do think it's very interesting and obviously very important for gut health, obviously very important for gut barriers. And I do think, the leaky gut that you've been talking about for years is a player for so many people that have suboptimal gut function.
We took such a hit in the day when we were talking about leaky gut and its relationship to neurodegenerative conditions. That was 20 years ago. now the gut-brain connection, it sort of rolls off your tongue pretty easily. Let me shift our conversation to an area I think that's going to pique a lot of interest, and that is the GLP-1 agonist drugs that have a dramatic effect on metabolism, certainly an effect on mitochondrial function, at least in diabetics, and are, in terms of what they're doing for diabetes and obesity, I think to be fair, it's pretty aggressive but breathtaking. We're seeing initial reports of reduced risk of development of Alzheimer's over a 3-year period of time in individuals using semaglutide, Ozempic, in comparison to other anti-diabetic agents. And the largest difference was in comparison to the use of insulin in a type 2 diabetic. Why would you do that? I don't know. But nonetheless, but it does raise the idea. I mean, I like to talk about it because it's simply saying, look, this is showing that improving metabolism is good for the brain. But what do we do with this data, especially in knowing that there are going to be phase 3 trials pretty soon, interventional trials, looking at treating Alzheimer's patients by using GLP-1 agonist drugs? What's your take on this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area. When you have something that comes on new, the way penicillin did, almost 100 years ago now, 80 years ago plus, and it seems to be good for everything. It tells you that you're dealing with something that is a common problem. In that case, microbes. Now we're talking about metabolic abnormalities. And so all these different things that's going to be probably helpful in, kidney damage and brain damage and heart damage, on and on and on. So it really proves that what we've been talking about over the years with metabolic abnormalities being so critical to cognitive decline is correct. That is something because these things
Exactly.
are now improving it. Now, the trick is, are they going to do it without having a lot of concerning side effects? What I've been wondering is, should we be taking, especially the people who have high BMIs and who have insulin resistance, and maybe for the first 3 months, while we get them into ketosis, while we get things going, we put them on a GLP-1 agonist. That's actually not such a bad problem. And it's interesting. As of 6 years ago, I was recommending Januvia for those people who were that was pre-Ozempic and pre all that stuff. Of course, now they've done head-to-head Januvia with a GLP-1, and the GLP-1s outperform Januvia. So, but the idea was the same. You're now improving the endogenous insulin. Now, where you have to be a little careful, as you know, there are things like gastroparesis that can really limit this for some people. We don't know what the long-term issues are because you're getting this unnatural effect, unfortunately, in this hormonal system. It's lasting much longer than it usually would. So what's going to happen with that in the long run? We don't know yet. But I think that there is a place for these, and especially for those who need a quick way to become more insulin sensitive. Now you have to remember, it's allowing them to make more endogenous insulin. So you could be suborning insulin resistance. And this is the same thing as several years ago, there was a trial where they tried intranasal insulin. It sounded so good. Let's get insulin into the brain. Well, the problem is you may be creating, and that trial failed, unfortunately, partly, I think, because it was a monotherapy, but you're also creating more insulin resistance. So I think with those caveats, there's a place for it.
I mean, you're treating a situation using insulin for a situation in which insulin is already high.
It can be, yeah.
Right,
So
it can be, and well, certainly as it relates to the type 2 diabetic who's insulin resistant, why don't we, if you check their insulin levels, by and large, we probably agree that those levels are going to be elevated to start off with anyway. And
Yep.
it's not the issue that you don't have enough insulin, it's that there's issues with its functionality.
Exactly right. And what's interesting? If you look at the insulin receptor and then its interaction with IRS1, its major signaling molecule, guess what interferes with that insulin signaling? Amyloid. So amyloid is intimately related to glucose metabolism. Again, it brings it right back to the fructose work that you and Rick Johnson and others have talked about. Very, very interesting. So there is this intimate relationship between the amyloid of Alzheimer's and insulin signaling and glucose utilization once again. So yeah, I think you make a good point.
Yeah, let me make circle back to one of the things you were talking about, the oral microbiome, and I think in the context of of nitric oxide. And I think, we recognize nitric oxide is important for perfusion, for blood supply, but also fundamental for insulin functionality.
Yeah, very good point.
So it relates it back, to some of these other mechanisms. Let me
Kind
take,
of sounds like a whole system that works together, doesn't it?
who knew? Let's walk back before GLP-1 and just double click on metformin for a moment. I mean, there's been some sense that metformin might be a good approach, either as a preventive or even as an interventional approach to Alzheimer's or other forms of neurodegenerative conditions because of its role in terms of insulin functionality, AMP kinase activation, et cetera. Any thoughts on utilizing metformin in a non-diabetic, let me say?
Yeah. So here's the issue with metformin, why I've never been a big fan of metformin. Metformin has a positive and a negative, and depending on which one which one dominates for each individual, you may get a positive or a negative effect. There was a study a number of years ago that showed increased neurodegeneration in people who had taken metformin. Now, of course, there's a huge push anti-aging effects of metformin and things like this. So there are a lot of people that are already on metformin. However, the problem is the way it works. You mentioned the AMP kinase. The way it triggers your AMP kinase is by preventing you from making the ATP that would normally inhibit that. So what you're really doing is you're saying, okay, you're eating, you're trying to do everything to get more energetics, but I'm going to block that so that you'll have more AMP and you'll now activate your AMP kinase. So yeah, theoretically, that can give you a longer lifespan. The problem is you're doing it at the expense of energetics. And which is why, I mean, it's interesting. It actually has an effect that is not terribly different from MPTP, which we know is a toxin that gives you Parkinson's disease. So what you're doing is you're tweaking that same system so that you can drop the energetics and get the organism to go into this pathway in which you get a greater longevity because you don't have energy. So what I'm trying to do is get the energy high.
There's been some discussion, though, that might actually be a good thing. I mean, that the idea of uh, downregulating at least complex 1 activity is a goal, because then the mitochondria will recover from that stress in a way that enhances mitochondrial biogenesis and functionality, with some discussion that that's how polyphenols ultimately are beneficial, because they are actually down stressing mitochondria.
So this is getting into hormesis. You are now taking this system and putting a little stress on it. So again, as I said, there's a good and a bad. You got to be careful. You put too much stress on that system, you're going to have some downsizing. You may get some Parkinson's. You may get some Alzheimer's. If you stress it a little bit and it bounces back, then you're in good shape.
One wonders then, why would this mitochondrial toxin in MPTP be so selective if it's actually, it is not a mitochondrial toxin. It's not a toxin at all. It is metabolized to MPP plus and then becomes an issue. So the question is, why just those cells, the dopaminergic neurons in the pars compacta of the substantia nigra, why do they suffer? And I wondered about that for a while, and I learned that it is selectively transported into the neuron by the
Exactly.
dopamine transporter, A, and B, that the conversion of MPTP to become the toxic MPP plus requires monoamine oxidase type B, which is in the highest concentration in that area of the brain. So, you wonder why that wouldn't be considered like a global brain toxin. Just sort of interesting. Here, let me throw something at you. This is really not scripted, but why men more than women in Parkinson's? Have you wondered about that?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's about 1.8 men for each woman. We've got women getting more Alzheimer's, almost 2 to 1. We've got men getting more ALS and men getting more Parkinson's. And if you go back to the antagonistic pleiotropy idea, you're looking at things like hormonal changes in women that may drive this. My guess is anything that is related to power or things where men were classically using it up more than women, In this case, it's motor modulation. But I have to say, the greatest motor modulation I've ever seen in my life is Simone Biles. So I think she's pretty amazing with that particular system. So my guess is the increase may have to do with either the overutilization of that system over time, or it may be something simpler, like men tend to be exposed to more mitochondrial toxins. It is a ultimately damage to mitochondrial complex 1. It's the firefighters that were out there with the smoke tend to get this disease.
Or maybe more head trauma.
And head trauma is another great one. Yeah, absolutely. So all of these things that put that particular system at risk, maybe. And again, it may even be differences in food that has been eaten, or there are all sorts of things. I would mention, as you know, the common things that are driving this in that particular network are the organic toxicants. You mentioned MPP plus, MPTP. But it's the things like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene and dieldrin and paraquat. And it may be that men have a somewhat more exposure to that, or that they are not as good at getting rid of the exposure to those things. But those are the common things.
I would add to that list Maneb and Mancozeb being fungicides that are still sold online to be, which are mitochondrial toxins, to be used on our vegetable gardens. Kind of interesting. I'm going to ask you if you could put your nickel down on something, and that is just kind of the global question. Is there evidence that women postmenopausal should be taking estrogen replacement as a hedge against Alzheimer's development?
Yeah, I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of that. And I work with and talk with frequently a number of hormone experts, such as Dr. Anne Hathaway, Dr. Felice Gersh, Dr. Robbie Brinton has been a colleague I've known for many years. And it's very clear that you've got multiple benefits, especially when you start early. Although, as they'll tell you,
That's right.
they have people in their 90s that will get cognitive benefit from should be bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And your estradiol, you have estrogen receptors in the brain. Interestingly, when we were looking at APP cleavage and we looked at what are the things that are driving this, estradiol binds to its receptor, enters the nucleus, of course, affects hundreds of genes. One of the things that it turns up is the alpha secretase that cleaves the APP to give you the connection, to give you that supportive side. So right there, that's the mechanism is very suggestive. And then, of course, progesterone turns out to be very important as part of your detox mechanism. So I think the evidence is overwhelming that BHRT is supportive.
I don't want it to get lost that you said that earlier is better. And I think what Dr. Lisa Mosconi demonstrated was that there really, at least with estrogen progesterone replacement, that the benefits of midlife, commencing therapy at midlife, perimenopausal, as opposed to waiting until postmenopausal, seem to be much better in terms of Alzheimer's risk reduction. Another interesting mechanism that I've seen recently is that estradiol helps reduce the binding to synapses of C3. Complement 3 labels synapses such that they are then primed for digestion from the microglial cells, and that's reduced with the presence of estradiol. Interestingly, in Alzheimer's brains in men, there's a 5-fold increase of the C3 binding synapses, and in women, it's as much as a 28-fold increase in the Alzheimer's women of that C3 binding to the synapse to label it for digestion. So that is reduced then in the presence of, at least in the animal, reduced in the presence of estradiol. So as you know, I am writing a book, and I came down very much in favor of HRT as well. So good to know.
Yeah, I think that the data are very clear. And, I want to mention one thing because you talked about timing. We were taught that Alzheimer's is a disease of older people, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, old-timers disease, exactly. And what has become very clear, this is a disease of your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that gets diagnosed in your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And this, again, another reason why knowing your blood, p-tau, et cetera, when you're relatively young can be helpful. So it is very clear that these changes are beginning much earlier, and we need to look early and be able to pick them up and say, okay, let's not ever let this get to the point of having dementia.
Well, I think, that's a really great point that the metabolic changes that you can see on the type of scan you mentioned earlier, these fluorodeoxyglucose PET scans demonstrating brain metabolism, are happening in people's 30s and 40s, presaging the cognitive manifestations by 2 to 3 decades. But yet, it's sort of the notion of, well, we'll deal with it once you start forgetting people's names, et cetera. Then we'll come to the rescue. And I think your message in your new book, I think more so than before. I mean, before you've been really talking about targeting Alzheimer's. This is a brain maintenance program, I think, centric, dealing with what we should be doing now to keep our brains healthy so that we don't have to deal with this problem later on. I have to say that when I'm asked that question, when should the Alzheimer's prevention program begin? I have been using your answer that you just provided us. Then when you think about it, when you look at the rates of obesity and diabetes in adolescence, maybe we should be thinking about that. Or what about childhood? What about how a child is born? What about in utero? I mean, when, these influences on an infant microbiome based upon method of birth are pretty profound and lifelong. For the most part, they self-correct at 2 or 3 years, but I think early childhood sets the stage for metabolic issues, that can become lifelong in terms of habit anyway.
Absolutely. And this is really, the book is really about performance and protection. And the idea is, yes, people talk about disease, like Alzheimer's and stuff, but we also want optimal performance. And for so many people, even young, as you said, you're all these issues when you're young, things like, how's your airway? Are you developing your jaw normally? Are you developing normal oxygenation? So, you really can think of this as a problem from cradle to grave. The entire life, there are things that are impacting your sharpness. And we all know the guy that goes into class in third grade and falls asleep every day because, he has problems at home, or he's not sleeping, or he's staying up all night, or whatever. We know about all ADHD. There's such an issue for people. Autism and the relationship. Years ago, we tried to create Alzflymers. It was a fruit fly model of Alzheimer's so we could study Alzheimer's genetics better. When we put human Alzheimer genes into fruit flies, guess what? They didn't get Alzheimer's. They got ADHD. And it was this is published, all criteria. They were more in males. It was treated by the same drugs like dextroamphetamine beautifully. They had increased movement all the time. And of course, carbs made them go crazy. So it was a perfect model for ADHD. And there's more and more work, as you know, published about the relationship between ADHD and cognitive decline. So I think that you're right. This is a whole life issue.
Well, great, and you did a heck of a job in the new book. And what I like about it is I think to be fair, you've been writing over the years books for people whose loved ones are now in the throes about now what can we do. And you've talked about your program, the Recode program, which is monumental in terms of here's an answer for you. And of course, people can avail themselves of that around the country. But now it takes us upstream, and that is to a place of, as you say, repair and but not just repair, but redirect the brain to a better destiny. So it's I'm very excited about the launch. It's going to really impact a lot of people. And as I've said to you many times, I'm very grateful for what you're doing, and certainly grateful for your friendship as well.
And I'm for yours as well, and grateful that you're telling the world about things that haven't been known and haven't been done. And the thing that really kills me is so many people can do so much better if they know this information, and yet it's not being put out there by the standard of care. And so, unfortunately, people are failing needlessly. They are having cognitive issues needlessly. They're having suboptimal performance, suboptimal protection. So grateful for the work you're doing. We look forward to seeing you out here the next time you visit.
It may be a little bit more extensive than just a visit. Who knows?
Yeah, we'd love to see you. That would be great.
All right. Talk to you
Okay.
soon. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you, David. Please say hi to Lise and the whole family.
Will do.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Wow. So nice to see Dale again. And he is really the leader in this entire field of prevention as it relates to maintaining good brain health. Again, here's his new book, The Ageless Brain. I would strongly recommend looking at it. There's a lot of great information, some of which we covered today, but obviously the book has a lot more to offer. Thank you all for joining us today on The Empowering Neurologist. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter, and we will be back soon. Bye for now.